This is FinTech Insights, a series of conversations about the changing technology and payments innovations impacting the U.S. financial landscape. FinTech Insights is underwritten by the William Mills Agency. William Mills Agency, the nation's preeminent public relations and marketing firm for the financial industry. For more information, visit www.williammills.com.
Bob, welcome to FinTech Insights.
Frank, it's my pleasure. Pleasure to be with you today.
You know, one of our goals, our primary mission really is to take a look at technology and payment innovations that are impacting the U.S. financial landscape. I can't think of a more on-the-ground area of attack as far as impact is concerned than the traditional banking industry, and certainly I would guess the disruptive change that's happening in the infrastructure of that, institution, and that being the whole idea of banks and physical locations and branch banking. Let's talk a little bit about the whole subject, the topic of branch banking. Tell me a little bit about where are we at now, and where do you see it going in the near future?
Well, funny, Frank, that you use the term branch banking. Most banks don't talk of it in those terms anymore, although that used to be very commonplace when branches were the only retail delivery channel, right? Of course, that's not the case anymore with the ATMs in the 70s, telephone bank in the 80s, internet banking in the 90s, and now mobile and arguably even social media as a touch point with one's bank or credit union. But you would think that banks would be right on top of this, but in our view, they're not really. Many banks are overly reliant on the branch as a distribution channel, and are slow to modernize branch infrastructures to keep time with these rapidly changing consumer preferences and needs.
Well, it was funny. We were having a conversation the other day regarding social media and the impact it has on a structured culture that's used to doing things in a pretty predictable way. And obviously in the banking system, that infrastructure, coming at it, as I often say, a tourist looking at it as an amateur, one would think it's probably one of the most formal, structured, secured environments, literally, figuratively, that's out there. So I guess one would expect it being resistant to the cultural adaptation to any kind of technology. But then again, on the other side, it's been an IT situation for many years, correct? I mean, in terms of internal structure and how they handle the whole processing internally?
Yeah, very much so. Culturally, social media is difficult for banks, and they're not alone in that realm. Most bank executives are not young Gen Y, right? And may not be particularly savvy in social media. But those banks that are becoming so are hiring employees that bring that familiarity and wisdom along with them.
Well, it's not so much a question regarding social media as it is regarding change. The fact that, as you were mentioning, you would think that the banks would be at the cutting edge, and yet they're a little behind. I'm sort of, as I began the discussion, they've kind of been attacked from a lot of different ways in terms of quote-unquote change as far as their whole industry is concerned. I was in a Walmart the other day, and there was this large sign that, and I like to think from a conceptual standpoint, I stay on top of a lot of things that are happening in a lot of verticals. There's this big sign that says, guess what, you can use your iPhone now, make your purchases by simply scanning, and it'll handle all of your purchasing and pretty much you total it up, take it out of your account, and you walk out of the store with the products.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about, I guess the term would probably be better said, branch transformation. What can they do?
Well, I guess first thing I thought of, Frank, is that the topic of branch of the future or branch transformation is not a new topic in banking, right? It's been a hot topic of discussion for nearly a decade, but it's been mostly talk and very little action. What's different now is the business model of retail banking has gone from fairly easy and favorable to challenging and not very favorable, right? It's been the financial crisis and the aftermath with tons of regulation, with low interest rates, and with a lagging economy that's eroded, lending demand, among other things, has really made it a tough road to hoe for banks. And so they've been forced into a situation where they must find sources of revenue growth from not so obvious places, perhaps, and they must reduce their cost to serve. And if they don't do both, then they'll pay the price on Wall Street, right? So now suddenly banks are taking the idea of branch transformation seriously and are rethinking the role and the strategic importance of the bank branch. And so it's really been that the pain they've felt since the crisis more than staying close to customer needs that have brought about this change, in my opinion.
Well, I would also pose the issue that their competition isn't naturally the guy down the street anymore. Like we're talking about with electronic payments and a lot of the things that are happening now with the disruptive technologies, the cloud, obviously broadband being more pervasive than ever, then consumers being able to kind of take control of their own finances, quote unquote.
Yep.
Where does the competition come from and how do you compete in that realm? I guess one of the fascinating things for us would be, even if you deal with healthcare, a lot of cases they deal with, we call it big data now, analytics, and I think a lot of people that are not involved in, say, the healthcare industry don't realize how much best practices are identified by the information they gather. So the point I'm making is in a market where there hasn't been a whole lot of it in the traditional banking infrastructure, how does one become an expert on bank transformation?
Well, I think like any area of study, to be expert, one needs to put a comparatively significant amount of time and effort into it, right?
Well, sure,
but that's basically all I've done. Branch transformation, not all I've done, but all I've done to become relatively expert in this realm has been to become a student of the trends globally and survey tons of banks and solution providers and spoken to many of them and traveled to and fro, getting a first-hand look at what banks are doing and why, and understanding the varying degrees of success they've had.
Well, if you're in a position to do it without charging a consulting fee, give us some of the information and services that you've uncovered. What are you offering, or what are you talking about as far as what they can do?
Well, Celent is a research and advisory firm. We're a division of the Oliver Wyman Group, who's a fairly prominent management consulting firm, and our sweet spot is financial services technology. So I'm the nerd, and I write detailed, thick research reports on financial services technology topics. My areas of focus include branch and ATM channel technologies. So think of us perhaps as a Forrester research, but one who is focused on banking, insurance, and capital markets. So primarily we're providing syndicated research and ad hoc advisory services to our clients, who are, for the most part, mid to large-sized banks and credit unions, as well as the technology providers who focus on that market.
Well, share with us some of the things that are becoming, I guess, more pervasive conclusions on some of your research, and short-term, immediate things that can be done, and maybe kind of, and it's always dangerous to speculate anything more than I say probably 8 to 12 months with all of the successive change. I call it successive transformation. The whole idea that change doesn't even exist anymore, because change has to be static at some point in order to compare it to what's
right.
new. But in that environment, what are some of the things that, one, you're uncovering from the research and then offering back as information and guidance to your clients, and then maybe speculate a little bit about what's going to happen in the near future?
Sure, happy to. Well, so the idea of alternative distribution channels has been around for a long time, right? And in the context of retail banking. And rolling back the clock, many prophesied the death of the branch when the ATM came on, right? An automated teller machine, right? By its very name, implied that it would cannibalize teller transactions. And then came the internet and more recently mobile banking, right? But alas, none of those things have spelled the death of retail banking and in branch banking rather. And I think when you boil it all down, the fairly simple but profound reason is that increasingly consumers who are digitally driven are consuming transactions digitally, but they're engaging with their banks via face-to-face methods. So even as we survey the heaviest of mobile banking users who use their mobile banking platforms for all manner of bill payment and account-to-account transfers and to check balances, etc., if they have a substantive topic they need to discuss with their banker, they don't do it digitally. They trounce into the local branch. And so the implications of that are at least twofold. One is banks need to redesign their branches to be more efficient and effective at the reasons people are coming in, which are less and less about getting cash or depositing checks and more about problem resolution, about questions being answered, or hopefully about buying new financial services, right? And so the physical design, the technology, the staffing, the compensation, and the training of frontline staff all need to be different to reflect that growing reality. And the second challenge for banks is to learn how to engage customers digitally. So for years, the idea of these, what were once alternative channels, now the branch is an alternative channel for most consumers, but the idea has always been, well, mobile banking, internet banking, ATMs, those are all for migrating low-cost transactions, low-value transactions out of the branch to these lower-cost-to-serve channels. That was the whole reason for being. But if that continues to be the case, then all meaningful sales activity will be relegated to the branch, and that is an untenable outcome. So banks have to figure out how to reduce the reliance on the branch, not only to facilitate transactions, but also to engage customers, and that's going to be a challenge both technically and culturally for banks. Interesting,
because it's kind of a paradox, because in a way, if I'm understanding, and again, I come as an amateur, but hearing what you're saying is it's an evolving process, that the longevity may not be there in terms of the physical plant. I mean, what you're saying is that at some point, even and I think it's an epiphany when you say that most of the mobile activity, in fact, the large percentage of it, obviously, is transaction, and the actual relationship, the consulting advice, the direction, I guess financial management, can still be offered through a physical relationship at the operation itself, at the branch. And yet the other side of it is you're saying that in the long run, they're going to have to address this digitally. So am I correct in hearing that? Or are you saying that?
Very much so. So if you compare digitally driven consumers, defining as those who are unusually active on the internet with mobile devices, right? If you examine how they interact with their banks, it's very different from how they interact with virtually everyone else, right? Among digitally driven consumers, the significant majority text, they chat. A growing majority do FaceTime and video Skype, for example.
Yeah.
But virtually none of that is occurring with their retail financial institutions, partly because so few banks offer those capabilities, but also because consumers, old habits die hard, and they're going to need to be taught that these new capabilities are available when they're availed, and be sold on the benefits of interacting with their bank in this manner. And then when they choose to do so, the experience has got to be very rock solid, and all that stuff is easier said than done.
So, in a sense, as far as maybe the process over the next decade, would you say more a virtual branch rather than a physical branch? I mean, that the actual transformation, all of the services and the kind of relationship, even Skype and face-to-face, may not necessarily, it may be geographically driven like a GPS, where they identify you by your geographic location and emphasize the interest in terms of, say, real estate markets or that kind of thing from a local standpoint. In one way you would get it physically, but in a lot of ways you'll be getting it digitally as well.
Well, I think it's going to be, it won't be either or. The changes are going to happen concurrently. Right? We Celent think in the U.S. there will be substantially fewer branches in the next 10 years. But that won't happen quickly, because for the moment that's where the sales are coming from.
So would that be the reason that just recently, and I won't mention the name, but I read an article where one of the large banking groups had made a decision to go on an aggressive branch expansion program? So is that a case where they're looking to gain customers in the short haul?
Well, it's more of a geographical play in most cases. Industry-wide, we're seeing a modest contraction in the total number of branches, or better said, the density branches per million households, because the country's still, household population is still growing. But we think branch densities industry-wide are going to be very different in 10 years from now, but that doesn't mean that any given bank who is either not present in a certain geography or underdeveloped in a market might choose to invest in new branches.
So it's a strategic play,
right,
as much as as much as it's a customer service situation. I guess that's a sort of an oxymoron in itself, because one is kind of supports the other. Well, let's talk a little bit about the whole issue of money. I'd love your opinion while I've got you in this conversation. Tell us a little bit about the whole concept of going to a transactional environment where there's actually no currency.
Well, that's an old idea too, and an idea whose time has still yet not come, right?
Mm-hmm.
So from a very practical matter, and especially with growing, which I think is ostensibly true, growing consumer concern over Big Brother, over privacy, right? With a large number of stories in the media recently, there's growing interest in transacting via cash in order to not have a rigorous.
Interesting perspective.
tracker.
I get that. Yeah, okay.
And certainly, psychology aside, so long as the U.S. has a tax code such as it does, there will be a compelling reason to provide some
creative alternatides.
Well, sure. So, for example, maybe if you have children, I have 4 kids, and several of them put their way through college by waiting tables. Well, ask any waiter or waitress, they would, or server, I guess, they'd much rather be paid in cash than on credit card, and the reasons are obvious, right? And if one looks at the large black and gray market in the U.S., right, it's very clear that as long as we have a tax system that we do, and I'm not trying to make a political statement here as much as saying practically cash isn't going to go away anytime soon.
Well, we mentioned earlier about cultural conflicts in terms of adoption of technology. Generationally, I guess there's a lot of cultural issues as well, and as it relates to the idea of credit, the idea of what is, depending on what you call it, millenniums, Generation X, the relationship they have with financial management. Let's talk a little bit. We touched upon social media, and I know that's not necessarily your particular focus, but you're involved in the greater discussion, gamification. Do you see the banking system getting more involved in what's actually happening, not just in gaming as it relates to entertainment, but even enterprise now is dealing with rewards and incentives and that kind of thing because of the interrelationship that it has to the target audience it's trying to reach? Is that something you see or hear happening in the banking industry?
Yeah, certainly, or I would say more broadly in the payments industry, and banks aren't the only actors right in that industry, but there's clearly a growing number of players seeking to move payments to digital and specifically to mobile platforms, because in part at least, payments are simply information, right? And so that's not the only information that's relevant, and there's a growing number of mobile use cases that can be rather compelling when the payment instrument is coupled with other useful information to affect purchase decisions, particularly if combined with geolocation. Right. So most observers in the industry point to slower than expected adoption of mobile payments, but I think it's inevitable. But like any massive change in consumer behavior, it's not going to happen quickly.
One last point, and that would be, the area of research, I guess now is part, if not totally evolved into analytics and the whole concept of big data. And you were mentioning, a certain level of I guess, more of a aggressive posturing as far as product offerings are concerned. One last question would be, what about pattern detection? I mean, you're at the core where I think most of the people will say that the vast majority of data and information about an individual is happening by the way they transact. Mm-hmm. Does the banking industry see that as a cutting edge, or are they adopting it and already involved in it?
Well, if you ask the question about is customer information a source of competitive advantage, most banks would say absolutely, and that's important to us, and we're on it. If you ask the question in the context of big data, you'll get very different answers, in part because big data is trendy and ill-defined, in my opinion, right? Mm-hmm. But if we say, okay, never mind the terminology, customer analytics is absolutely a huge imperative for banks, and they're getting on board. But it's not just technology; it's culture. It's learning how to ask questions very differently. It's learning how to make decisions very differently than in the past, and that's what's going to take some time. But going kind of back to this face-to-face versus digital engagement paradigm, right? If banks and all manner of retail merchants, for that matter, if they are to engage with customers increasingly digitally, at least as an option to face-to-face contact, how in the world can you do that without rigorous real-time use of analytics? I don't know of any other way. You can't throw bodies at it.
Yeah, right.
So analytics very much is an imperative, and it's a greenfield for banks, and folks are learning daily new use cases and new benefits and new applications for this.
You know, it's kind of ironic. I hear an underlying discussion. You don't hear very much of it. I think it's more generational conflict. You know, everybody talks about how chaotic and how busy they are and how many texts and tweets and whatever they're having to deal with. And a lot of people are saying, you know, we're losing that face-to-face relationship type of sale situation for sure in a selling proposition, but even in building customer relations, it could be ironic enough that as the circle continues to evolve, that one of the unique selling propositions, the competitive advantage for the old school financial banking institutions, is to actually do the old school method of dealing with their customers in that face-to-face way. That wasn't posed as a question, but as an observation. Sometimes it's funny how everything that old eventually kind of comes back again in some variation or another. Well, interesting topic. You certainly are on the front line when we talk about fintech and we talk about the whole payments environment. There's the whole technology aspect of it, but then there's this whole institutional component and the evolution that it's having to face. Bob, thanks a lot for the insights, and really thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us today on FinTech Insights.
Frank, it's been my pleasure. Good speaking with you.